The crystal champagne flute felt unnervingly fragile in my hand, a delicate vessel holding a moment that was supposed to be effervescent and bright. Instead, it felt like a shard of ice, chilling my fingers to the bone. Robert's hand rested on my back, a warm, solid presence that was the only anchor in the suddenly tilting room. Across the expanse of white linen and pale roses, my mother, Evelyn, was standing. She tapped her own glass with a manicured nail, the sound a sharp, insistent chime that cut through the gentle murmur of our guests. She was smiling, but it wasn't a smile that reached her eyes. It was the smile she reserved for photo albums and uncomfortable truths, a polished veneer over a core of something cold and dismissive. "I'd like to say a few words about my daughter, Eleanor," she began, her voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who enjoyed being the center of attention. A hush fell over the room. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I had specifically asked her not to give a toast. I had known, with a certainty born of 58 years of experience, that it would not be a gift. It would be a performance. "Eleanor," she said, turning her head slightly to pin me with her gaze. "Always the quiet one." Always, so practical, the word landed like a stone, heavy with unspoken meaning, plain, unremarkable, dutiful. I must admit, I never thought I'd see this day. A few people tittered, unsure if it was a joke. I knew it wasn't. It was a statement of fact as she saw it. She spent so much of her life taking care of things. Taking care of us. She gestured vaguely to my brother and sister, who were seated at her table, nodding along with placid smiles. Always there in the background. The reliable one. "You know, when her father passed, I told her, Eleanor, you'll have to be the strong one now," and she was. Oh, she was. My breath caught in my throat. She was painting a picture of me as a spinster, a household fixture whose only purpose was to serve. She was erasing the entirety of my life, my career, my identity, and reframing it as a long, gray corridor of servitude that had, miraculously, led to this brightly lit room. Robert's thumb began to rub gentle circles on my back. He knew. He had met my family. He understood the subtle language of their cruelty. So to see her here today, in this beautiful dress, with a wonderful man like Robert, my mother paused, letting the silence hang in the air. She took a delicate sip of her champagne. And then, she laughed. It wasn't a joyful, celebratory laugh. It was a short, sharp burst of sound, full of incredulity and a strange, pitying amusement. It was the laugh of someone watching a dog perform a particularly clever but ultimately ridiculous trick. "Well," she finished, raising her glass. "It just goes to show you. Miracles really do happen." The laughter died, but its echo remained. It bounced off the walls and settled in my bones, a cold, vibrating hum of pure humiliation. The room was silent for a beat too long. My brother, David, started clapping enthusiastically, and a few others joined in, a scattered, uncertain applause. I didn't cry. I had learned long ago that tears were a currency my mother did not value. They were a sign of weakness she would exploit. So I simply stood there, my own smile now a perfect, brittle mask. I looked at the faces of my family, and for the first time, I didn't see the people I was bound to by blood. I saw strangers who wore familiar faces. I saw the architects of a cage I had only just realized I was living in. Then, something shifted. In the back of the room, a man stood up. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark blue dress uniform immaculate, adorned with ribbons that told stories of places I knew only from maps and news reports. It was Master Gunnery Sergeant Cole, a man whose quiet dignity I had come to admire deeply over the past decade. He didn't say a word. He simply stood at attention. Then another man in uniform stood, and another, and another. In a wave of silent, coordinated movement, every single Marine in the room rose to their feet. There were 200 of them, men and women I had worked with, counseled, and sometimes, simply sat with in shared silence. They were my colleagues, my friends, the silent witnesses to the part of my life my family had never bothered to see. Master Gunnery Sergeant Cole's voice cut through the stunned silence, as crisp and clear as a bugle call. Ma'am, it was not a question. It was a statement. A title. An honorific. And then, as one, they raised their hands in a slow, deliberate salute. It wasn't for the bride. It was for me. For Eleanor. For the woman they knew. 200 men and women, warriors and protectors, stood in silent, unified respect. They held the salute, their eyes fixed on me, creating a shield of honor so profound, so absolute, that my mother's petty cruelty simply evaporated against it. The laughter was gone. The humiliation was gone. In its place, a sense of clarity washed over me, cold and pure and utterly transformative. In that moment, watching the unwavering respect in their eyes, I finally understood. I had been looking for acceptance in the wrong room my entire life. And in that same moment, a quiet decision took root in my soul. It was done. I was finished. The rest of the wedding passed in a blur of surreal calm. Robert never left my side, his presence a constant reassurance. My mother, for once, was speechless. She sat at her table, her face a confused mask of indignation, occasionally glancing towards the uniformed contingent as if they were a strange, indecipherable art installation. My siblings followed her lead, whispering behind their hands. They didn't understand what had just happened, and the truth was, they were incapable of understanding. To them, my life was a small, simple thing, a tidy house, a quiet job they never asked about, and a bottomless well of availability for their needs. The idea that I commanded the respect of 200 United States Marines was a concept their minds could not accommodate. It broke the narrative they had built around me, the one that made them comfortable, the one that made me small. When Robert and I finally left, escorted through a saber arch I hadn't expected, but which brought a lump to my throat, I didn't look back at my mother. I didn't need to. The connection, that thin, frayed cord that had bound me to her expectations and disappointments for nearly 6 decades, had been severed by the sharp, clean edge of that salute. In the car, as the city lights slid past the window, Robert took my hand. "Are you all right, Ellie?" he asked, his voice gentle. I turned to him, the man who had come into my life like a soft dawn after a long night, and I smiled, a real smile this time. "I'm better than all right, Robert," I said, and the words tasted of freedom. "I'm awake." That night, in the quiet of our new home, the decision I'd made at the reception settled from a fierce, hot realization into a cool, calm plan. It wasn't about revenge. Revenge was a hot, messy emotion, and I was done with those. This was about correction. It was about balancing the ledger of my life, which had been tipped in my family's favor for far too long. I thought back over the years, the memories now replaying not as a series of sad obligations, but as evidence in a case I was building for my own liberation. I remembered being 22, freshly graduated with a degree in psychology, my dreams set on a doctorate program. My father had just received a frightening diagnosis, and my mother had sat me down in the living room, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Eleanor," she'd said, her voice soft with practiced concern. "Your brother is starting his business. Your sister is getting married. They have their own lives to build. We need you right now, we need you. Not, we love you or we support you, but we need you." And so I stayed. I got a job at the local community center to help with the bills. The doctorate was deferred, then forgotten. I became the anchor, the steady, reliable fixture while my siblings' ships sailed off to grander horizons. David's tech startup, funded in part by the money I had saved for my tuition, a loan, he'd called it, that was never repaid. Sarah's lavish wedding, for which I did all the planning, the unpaid coordinator working tirelessly in the background so she could be the star. Years later, after my father passed, the house became my responsibility. It was legally mine, left to me in his will with a quiet, knowing look that I only now understood. But my family treated it like a communal resource, a free hotel and storage unit. My mother moved into the master suite, claiming she couldn't possibly manage on her own, though her health was perfect. She redecorated with my money, hosted her bridge club, and held court as the grieving widow, while I was the one who paid the mortgage, fixed the leaky roof, and mowed the lawn. I was a ghost in my own home. My career was a footnote in their lives. When I took the position at the Marine Corps base, a demanding, emotionally taxing job as a civilian counselor for the Deployment Readiness Program, my mother had waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, that's nice, dear. Something to keep you busy." They never asked what I did. They never knew about the late nights I spent with a young wife terrified for her husband overseas, or the painstaking work of helping a young Marine process the trauma of what he'd seen, or the quiet honor of sitting with a Gold Star family who had lost everything. That world, my real world, the one where I was respected and valued, was invisible to them. I had built my life in the spaces they left vacant. I had become a master of emotional camouflage, hiding my strength, my competence, my very identity, so as not to disrupt their comfortable view of me. And for what? For a strained Christmas dinner once a year. For a birthday card signed "Love, Mom" in my sister's handwriting. For the privilege of being the first person they called in a crisis, and the last one they thought of in a celebration. The salute at my wedding hadn't just been a shield, it had been a mirror. It had shown me who I was, not to them, but to myself. And I liked the woman I saw in that reflection. It was time to let her live, fully and without apology. Lying there beside my sleeping husband, I began to make a list in my head. It was a short list, but every item on it was a step on the path out of the shadows. The first step would be taken tomorrow. The next morning, I began. My first call was not to a family member, but to a real estate agent, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Maria whom I knew from a base charity event. "Maria," I said, my voice steady as I stood in the kitchen of the home I shared with Robert, the morning sun streaming in. "I need to sell a property." "The one on Oak Street." There was a brief pause on the other end. "The family home?" she asked, a hint of surprise in her tone. Everyone in town knew that house, knew my mother held court there. "It's my house," I replied, the words feeling solid and true. "And I'm selling it." We set an appointment for the following week. That was step 1. Step 2 was financial. For years, I had maintained a joint savings account with my mother. It had been her idea, established for emergencies, but the emergencies had always been hers: a new car when hers was looking drab, a cruise to the Caribbean because she was feeling low, a significant loan to my brother David for another of his failed business ventures. My contributions had been regular and substantial, hers had been non-existent. The account was supposed to be a safety net, but it had become a leash. I drove to the bank that afternoon. The teller, a young man named Kevin, smiled politely. "How can I help you, Ms. Gable?" He knew me by name. I had been making deposits into that account for 2 decades. "I'd like to close account number 70 for 58, I said, sliding the withdrawal slip across the counter. "I'll take the full balance in a cashier's check." He tapped at his computer, his eyebrows rising slightly. "The full balance? All of it?" I nodded. "Yes. All of it." As I walked out of the bank, the check tucked safely in my purse, I felt lighter. It wasn't about the money. It was about turning off the tap. Step 3 was communication. My phone had become an instrument of their control, a constant source of summonses and demands. Sarah needing a last-minute babysitter. David needing me to co-sign yet another loan. My mother needing me to run an errand she could easily do herself. That evening, Robert and I went to the phone store. I ported my old number to a cheap, prepaid phone which I then turned off and placed in a drawer. A digital dead end. My new number was given to a handful of people: Robert, my lawyer, Maria, the real estate agent, and a few close friends from work. The silence that followed was astounding. For the first time in my adult life, my phone was not a tether to someone else's crisis. It was just a tool, mine to use as I saw fit. The peace was palpable. Each action was quiet, methodical, and irreversible. There were no angry confrontations, no dramatic announcements. I was simply dismantling the scaffolding of their expectations, brick by brick. A week later, I met with my lawyer to update my will. For years my estate, which included the house and a modest investment portfolio I'd carefully built, was to be divided between my siblings, with a life estate for my mother in the home. It had seemed the fair, dutiful thing to do. Now it seemed like madness. My lawyer, a calm, older gentleman named Mr. Harris, listened patiently as I laid out the changes. Robert was to be my sole beneficiary. In the event we passed together, the entire estate would be liquidated and donated to establish a scholarship fund for the children of Marines, administered by the base's charitable foundation. "Are you certain, Eleanor?" he asked gently. "This is a significant change." I looked at the photograph on his desk, of him with what I assumed were his grandchildren. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," I told him. He simply nodded and made the notes. The ink from his pen felt like it was rewriting my future. The most difficult step was the house. Maria was efficient. She had it appraised and listed within days. The for sale sign on the front lawn of the Oak Street house was a quiet declaration of war, though I was the only one who knew it. The first call came from my sister, Sarah. Her voice was a high-pitched squeak of disbelief. "Ellie? What is going on? There's a sign on the lawn. Mother is having a fit." I let her finish, my silence a stark contrast to her hysteria. "It's my house, Sarah," I said calmly. "I'm selling it." "Your house? It's the family home. Where is Mother supposed to live? Where will we have Christmas?" The "we" was telling. She wasn't worried about my mother's well-being, she was worried about the loss of her free holiday venue. Mother is a healthy woman with a generous survivor's pension from Dad, and a significant amount of money in her own accounts. She can afford to live wherever she chooses, I stated, the facts laid out like polished stones. "As for Christmas, I'm sure you and David can host this year." There was a sputtering on the other end of the line. But you can't just do this without talking to us." "I am talking to you now," I said, my voice even. "The decision is made. The house is for sale." I didn't wait for a reply. I simply said, "I have to go now, Sarah," and ended the call. The expected storm arrived 2 days later. A car screeched to a halt in my driveway, and my mother, flanked by David and Sarah, marched up to my front door. They didn't knock. David simply tried the handle, and finding it locked, began to pound on the wood. I watched them from the window for a moment, a united front of entitlement. Robert stood behind me, his hand on my shoulder. "I'm here, Ellie," he murmured. I opened the door. My mother pushed past me into the foyer, her face a thunderous mask. "Eleanor, what is the meaning of this? You have humiliated me. First that spectacle at your wedding, and now this. Selling our home out from under me." "It is not your home, Mother." "It is mine," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I did not raise it. I didn't need to." My calmness was its own form of power, a wall she could not scale with her usual histrionics. "After everything I've done for you," she cried, her voice rising. "After all the sacrifices I've made." It was such a stunningly false statement that a laugh almost escaped me. The sacrifices had all been mine. The life deferred, the dreams discarded, the savings drained. I had been the family sacrifice, the lamb laid on the altar of their comfort and convenience. "And the money?" David chimed in, stepping forward, his face flushed with anger. "I went to the bank. The joint account is empty." "You cleaned it out." "That was our emergency fund." "It was my emergency fund," I corrected him gently. "And my emergency has arrived." The emergency was realizing I was being used as a bank, a caretaker, and a doormat, and that it was time for it to stop. Sarah began to cry, her usual tactic when things didn't go her way. "How can you be so cruel, Ellie? To your own mother? After all she's been through." And there it was. The final, desperate play. The appeal to a guilt I no longer felt. I looked at the three of them, their faces contorted with anger and disbelief, and I felt nothing but a profound, sad pity. They genuinely could not see it. They could not see me. They could only see the disruption to their lives, the closing of a resource they had taken for granted. "You want to talk about cruelty?" I asked, my voice still level. "Let's talk about my wedding day. You stood up in front of all my friends, my husband, my colleagues, and you laughed at me, Mother. You laughed because you couldn't comprehend that the plain, practical, background person you created in your own mind could possibly be worthy of happiness and respect. You tried to make me small because my happiness made you feel irrelevant." I paused, letting the words sink in. "But you know what you didn't see? You didn't see the 200 Marines who stood up for me. You have no idea who I am, what I do, or the life I have built entirely separate from you. Those men and women, they see me. They respect me. They know my worth. And their respect is earned, not demanded. It's real. And it's all I need." I stepped back from the doorway. "The house will be sold. The accounts are closed. The will has been changed. This is my life now, with my husband. You are no longer a part of it in the way you were before. You will have to learn to take care of yourselves." My mother stared at me, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. For the first time in my life, I had left her speechless. David began to bluster, but I simply closed the door, gently but firmly, on his indignant face. The click of the lock was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a cage door swinging shut, with me on the outside. 6 months later, Robert and I were in our new home, a small cottage by the sea, 300 miles away from Oak Street. The old house had sold quickly. After settling my mother in a comfortable, modern apartment, a final, clean act of duty, not obligation, the remaining proceeds had funded our new beginning. The air here was clean and smelled of salt and freedom. I had transferred my job to a nearby naval base, doing similar work, finding the same quiet satisfaction in being of service to those who served. One evening, I was sitting on our porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. Robert brought me a cup of tea and sat beside me, taking my hand. We didn't speak for a while, just watched the light fade. In a box on the coffee table inside was a wedding album. I hadn't looked at it for months. I went inside and brought it out, opening it on my lap. I flipped past the staged family photos, my face a brittle smile in each one. I stopped at a candid shot someone had taken. It was of me and Robert, our heads close together, laughing. But it was the background that caught my eye. Over my shoulder, you could see them. A sea of blue uniforms, their faces turned towards us, smiling. Standing. And in the foreground, at the head table, my mother, David, and Sarah sat, looking small and confused, utterly oblivious to the real event that was taking place. I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me, a quiet joy that was deeper and more resilient than the fleeting happiness I had once chased. I had spent a lifetime trying to earn the love of people who were incapable of giving it. I had twisted myself into shapes that were not my own to fit into a family that had no real space for me. The laughter on my wedding day was not the end of my story. It was the beginning. It was the jarring, painful alarm clock that finally woke me up. It had been a gift, in its own cruel way. Some people are born into a family that nurtures them, that sees them and loves them for who they are. And some of us have to build that family for ourselves. We find it in the quiet respect of colleagues, in the steadfast love of a good partner, in the communities we choose to serve. Your family is not always defined by blood. It is defined by respect. It is defined by who stands for you when you feel like you cannot stand for yourself. Never be afraid to close a door that leads to a room where you are made to feel small. Your life is your own house. You get to decide who has a key. And sometimes the most courageous thing you can ever do is change the locks.